Good day again, and welcome back to the shed. It is Neil Whitman, the old soldier, and I'm going to be continuing this little foray into the conversation on our meaning crisis of today, the cause of our societal malaise and personal dissatisfaction in the world that we have found ourselves in. And if you followed me from the beginning or have gone back and listened, you'll know that one of the things that I like to harp on is integrity. But in that first video, I kind of approached that in a very specific way of trying to help you see the importance of having your integrity based on the right foundation. I think that if we don't build our foundation properly, you can have a structure that seems to have internal consistency, but is actually powerless to provide shelter against the real world that you're in, or to grow out into it into a productive way. And so we have to examine and challenge our premises. And so the first premise that I think we most get wrong, and I've addressed this in different ways in the past, but I want to just kind of bull right into it, is the premise of what we are, who we are, and what our will is. So the first question that I want to ask you is, why isn't Afghanistan better? See, in 2001, we all know that there were a group called Al-Qaeda. They were being housed and training themselves in Afghanistan. They orchestrated a plot in which they hijacked some planes. They flew them into the World Trade Center. And if you were old enough to remember that whole event, it was quite a shocking event to be. I was in college when it happened, in military college, and it changed the world. You know, it changed and altered our entire perception of what was going on in the world and how secure we were. And the consequences have continued to grow in our experience even till today. But one of the fascinating things, if you really want to look at the idea of the will and its expression in the world that has come out of that, is that we went into a country in Central Asia called Afghanistan. It's a country that has seen a lot of conflict. And if you have any knowledge of the history of that, just suffice to say that some of the caves that were being used for transporting weapons and supplies when I was there were supposedly built to shelter people from Alexander the Great. Like, it's been at war for a long time. It's in a natural conflict zone between competing powers. It's been a major trade route choke point for many years for trade from the east to the west and vice versa. And so these are people that have known fighting. And in recent years, you know, the British went in the late 19th century and tried to impose their will and culture on that people. That was a catastrophic failure. The Russians later on tried to convert using subversion to communism, and they created a communist government there, and that government then came under fire from its own people, and then the Russians went in open force, and they were defeated, not just by the Mujahideen, but by the U.S. Support to the Mujahideen in providing them with arms. Always strikes me as funny that, you know, the Rambo movie actually portrays them as the great and glorious agents of freedom that are fighting against communism. And then, of course, America with us Canadians and the Brits and other NATO allies went in there in 2001 to again try and impose our will upon them and to transform them into a free people. Of course, we thought we would do this by bringing them democracy and then kind of leading them towards personal freedom. Now, if you are tracking Afghanistan today, we fought a long war there, a long counterinsurgency, more specifically. And in 2007, I was there for one tour, did some other tours in various other places that also aren't better for the effort that was put into them. But we put a lot of wealth, we shed a lot of blood, ours and our enemies, and our nation strove mightily to exert our will upon that nation in order to conform it to what we thought was best for them. And yet that hasn't happened. It's still a war-torn country. The fundamental mores and philosophies of the people have not really changed, although where they may have been largely apathetic towards the West in the pre-2011 days, seeing us more as a mythological enemy of ideology. Now they have a very real hatred in most of the people there against us, and we have not received the desired outcome. Why is that the case? This is where we start to understand that there's a problem when we start thinking about our will as being free. This is probably going to be a contentious issue, and I have been accused in the past of blackpilling, which of course is that term used to describe trying to sow despair and apathy. This is not the case. This is very much a red pill argument, and if you're not familiar with where that comes from, that very popular internet terminology, the Matrix movie, which came out quite a few years ago, presented this character Neo, and Neo was just some guy who was, a computer worker, and he is doing his work and hacking and living his life, and over the course of this introduction, he runs into somebody who presents him with two options. He explains that the world is not what he thinks it is, and he offers him to take the blue pill, which will basically return him back to his normal reality that he believes is true, and it will kind of remove any awareness that he'd even been told of these other things, and the red pill would awaken him to the true nature of his reality, which is fundamentally very different, because of course he's in this computer simulation, and that wakes him up in the real world where everything is destroyed and robots rule the world and yada yada yada, and the story progresses. The thing about the analogy, because it is very powerful, it's a very wise analogy, whoever came up with it in the first place, is that it does not present the red pill as being a comfortable experience, that in fact it is much easier to live in one's false delusion of the world than to confront the reality of the world, and to try and then, in a much more desperate circumstance, to try and work within the constraints of that real world and make real changes that are tangible in not only your life but the lives of other people's. That's what I want to do here today, is to give you a little bit of the red pill experience and challenge even myself in this, because these are narratives that creep into us in our false perception of what we are and what our role is in this world. So, what are we? What is your will? I've talked a little bit about this, and I'll refer you back to my video on the self, in which I address the nature of our physical self versus our spiritual self, and kind of talk about the ability to resurrect a personality when the brain that was housing that personality was destroyed, which speaks to the otherness of ourself, that it's beyond simply the material chemical aspects that are functioning in our brain, that is simply an interaction of the flesh with the self and not the self. So you can go look at that if you want to get into that concept. But the first thing that we need to understand when we explore our will and our self is that we are not God. And we need to know that. We need to actually think about that, because fundamentally, our nature is to presume upon ourselves the authority and the power of God in our reality. We want to be sovereign over our story, but that isn't the case. I'm not going to talk about God a whole lot in here in the context of who God is and what God is. I will do that in a future video here and kind of explore the God of the systems versus the personal God of the Bible. But fundamentally, I will just briefly introduce this because we need to understand it to go on in this conversation. There is a God. Now, for all you materialists out there, you're probably not listening to this channel, but if you're struggling against that concept, accept this, that whether or not you want to accept the Christian God as God, there is a God. It's evident in creation that the order of the universe, the realities that constrain us and govern all of physical matter, all of human interaction, the biology, all of this, even if you want to constrain yourself to what Paul Vanderklay calls God one, you must recognize that there is a God. Even if you want to pretend that that God is, or if you want to presume, rather, that that God is simply an expression of the natural order of the universe, it exists. Like, there are physical constants which govern the nature of reality, and you have no authority over them. You can't change God. God is, and the universe is operating outside of your control of it. Like, we need to fundamentally understand that. You cannot, by your choice, neglect to obey the rules of gravity. Now, it is entirely possible that the rules of gravity allow for themselves to be manipulated should we understand them sufficiently to manipulate them using technology. That is not the same thing as negating them. It's like, say, if you exert your will enough, you can fly. By creating a plane that allows you to fly, fine. But that is not the same thing as you simply levitating. That is you understanding the order of nature and choosing in submission to the order of nature and the rules of physics and friction and air density and all of that stuff to, in perfect obedience to the laws that are and in perfect compliance to those laws, create something that operates within that order to defy the gravity for a time using power and lift, right? You haven't negated gravity by doing that. You can't negate natural order. You can only, by more fully understanding it and by obeying it, can you grow in your ability to operate more fully inside of those rules. So there is God, and he is outside of your domain. You may operate within his laws, and you can grow in your ability to do things within his laws, but you can't change them. That is fundamental truth in understanding what your will is. It is constrained by the order of nature. Fundamental. So you are not God. You do have a will. Obviously, you know that. And there are many, I've certainly heard the arguments put forward that free will is an illusion, that determinism is necessarily an observation that comes out of materialism, which is true, because if it is true that there is nothing other than material matter, I suppose, other than matter and the rules that govern it, then there is no spirit, according to those who would postulate that way. It is there necessarily true that our free will is an illusion. You can lie to yourself about that, but you know it's not true. You're expressing your will to make the argument if you're going to make it. And you can choose not to make that argument. You can choose to challenge your presuppositions by exerting your will. We have will. No one can sensibly argue against that reality. And I'm not going to get into some theological debate here on predestination and free will in a Christian context. You have a will, full stop. What is necessary to understand about that will is that it is fundamentally constrained. So there is a passage in Scripture recorded in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus, in teaching the people, makes this comment about oaths. And it's very insightful, and it's something that you should hear. Whether you accept Jesus as the Son of God or not, he is expressing wisdom here that you need to hear. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord. But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, because you cannot even make one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no be no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." So, what is he saying? He's saying don't proclaim that you will do something, because that presents a wrong view of yourself. You are being prideful and making false claims about things that you can in no certainty have authority over the outcome of. You can't swear by heaven. You don't control it. It's the natural order, right? Don't swear by heaven. Don't swear by earth, because although you have some strength to affect the earth, it is not in your control. Not at all. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, as to the deep constraints that are on your will and its ability to influence the earth. You can't swear by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And of course, he's talking here about the messianic prophecy that he believes is concerning himself, and he declares is concerning himself. But the point is very valid that you can't swear by Canada and you can't swear by the United States, because that is not an entity that is in your control. It's not even in the control of the king or the president or the prime minister, because it has a giant number of wills all acting. And how many kings have set their kingdom up for success in a certain way only to have that kingdom utterly disintegrate under them or after them? Alexander the Great created a great empire. It lived as long as he did, right? Less, because he didn't start it till he was 13. And he died at, I think, 33. So a 20-year collection of vassal states that then splintered into 4 kingdoms that immediately went to war with each other, etc., etc. Genghis the Khan, he built the greatest empire that the world has ever known, right, in terms of a land empire for its land mass. And he did it without modern technology like gunpowder, which is fairly impressive. And by the time his grandson was ruling, it was just a whole bunch of different khanates. Most of them had totally rejected the ideology he built the nation on, etc., etc. So don't presume that even should you rise to the most powerful position in a kingdom, that you are sovereign over that kingdom. Like, only you have influence over that kingdom's destiny while you have the power. You don't have the long-term control over what's going to happen with that. So don't swear by that. It's not yours. You don't own it. And don't even swear by your own head, Jesus says, because you don't have the ability by your will to change one hair on your head from white to black, or from black to white for that matter. Understand that. Like, you are deeply constrained in the exertion of your will. And here are just some of the ways that you need to accept the constraints of your will. The first one is the constraint of your will in time. So your will is deeply constrained in time. You have to understand that is true, right? Like, you cannot, no matter how much you desire, influence the past. It is closed to you. And even with what we understand about time and its ability to be manipulated, which it can, it only goes one way. Like, there is no way to go back in time in any form of theoretical physics, right? So you're stuck with what happened. You could theoretically get into a very fast-moving vessel outside of the gravity well of Earth, and you could accelerate yourself to such a degree that time would slow down vastly for you, and then you could come back and it would be 10,000 years later. That is hypothetically true, but that still doesn't change what happened in the past. You might even escape it to the point where no one even remembers it, but all you'll have done is have gone forward to a point where you haven't controlled anything in the interim, and you're in a new reality and you can't change the past. Simple fact, right? You can't actually affect the future now. Your will for what happens in the future is also deeply limited, because a little bit of biblical wisdom here. There is the parable Jesus told about the rich man who had built great big silos for himself to store up his grain. And then when he had stored up his grain and filled the silos, he said, "Now I will have peace and ease." And God said, "You foolish man, I tell you truly, tonight your life will be required from you. We are but a mist that passes away." We don't have control over how long we live. And all the health gurus on the internet are going to try and tell me I'm a heretic for saying that. Yeah, you can influence the longevity of your life by making healthy life choices. That doesn't change whether or not you have an aneurysm that's going to burst tonight. Doesn't change whether or not you might just be genetically predisposed to cancer, right? My son was born with a fatal heart defect. His heart was on backwards, and the aorta and pulmonary artery were grown into the wrong side of his heart. It wasn't because of health choices that were made. That was because of a genetic defect, and it was correctable by surgery. And now, he lives with a large aneurysm on his pulmonary artery, which is doing the service of his aorta. It's called transposition of the great arteries. You want to look that up. And at any moment, he is living very conscious of the reality that should he get bumped really bad the wrong way, he will just be dead more or less instantly if that ever ruptures. We should all be so aware of our fragility. My father often told me the story growing up. Now, my father is an interesting example of the limitations of will. He went parachuting as a birthday present when I was very young. I actually do remember the night because of my mother receiving a phone call from her aunt and responding to it by screaming, probably because of a not ideally transmitted message that led her to believe that her husband had died. But he went parachuting and his chute didn't flare and it tangled, and he couldn't clear it to get his secondary out, and so he streamered down and slammed into a paved driveway doing an extreme rate of knots. And somehow, not because he willed it, although he probably did manage to pull his instincts together on the little training he did and land as best as he could have, but he went feet first in the concrete and he broke his spine very badly, and basically lost 2 vertebrae in the impact in compacting them and having them explode. Didn't sever his spinal cord. Figure that one out. And he often told me the story growing up of being in rehab, and the fella who was in the bed beside him had also broken his back and I believe was paralyzed from the waist down. Had basically jumped over a stairwell when he was moving a piece of furniture or a fridge or something, and it had slipped, so he jumped over the stairwell to the next stairwell down, and he landed wrong, hit his back, and fallen like 6-10 feet, paralyzed himself. And there's Dad having jumped out of an airplane, and he actually did come out through a very strong exertion of his will to overcome the limitations in rehab. And I tell you, the man has an iron will like just about no one I've ever met, to endure the pain of that every day and to carry on and soldier on. But some real powerful lessons about our will here is that it wasn't his will that didn't sever his spinal cord. It wasn't his will that caused his parachute to not open, or a lack of will, right? It wasn't my father's will or lack of will to fail to be able to simply regenerate missing vertebrae and totally repair the damage to his nerves, right? What he did have freedom to exert his will in, and which he fully committed himself to doing in a way that should be exemplary to, I think, all men, is to dealing with the pain and carrying on and choosing to live and not just live in victim status for the difficulty of his life and making a living for himself as he could within his limitations and raising his kids, etc., etc. Like, there are things we can control, which is our response to the environment and the realities we face, but we don't actually get to control how our bodies react to the world, right? Like, we're constrained in time, we're constrained in biology, we're limited by our flesh. You know, I'm pretty dinged up from 20 years in the infantry. Had shoulder surgery a little over a year ago because my shoulder just don't work no more. It got ripped up real bad inside and scar tissue, and I was able to exert my will to carry on soldiering with as little complaint as I could in the midst of that, along with busted ankles and, you know, ripped up back and et cetera, you know, smashed arm and so on and so forth. And I was able to exert my will to accept medical treatment that was able to limit the consequences of that by taking away some of the pain and suffering that it so thoroughly gave me. And thankfully, in a way that was not subject to my will, the surgery was quite successful in taking away the pain by basically reaming out that shoulder. But I can't make it work the way that it used to, no matter how much I exert my will. All I can do is faithfully do the physiotherapy exercises to keep it strong and prevent further damage. Like, that's it, man. And maybe it'll heal somewhat, but that's out of my control because I don't actually control my biology. If we controlled our biology, no one would die, right? We'd all choose to be as healthy as possible, and we'd all overcome all sicknesses and diseases and injuries, and we would be healthy and happy. We wouldn't suffer from mental illnesses because we choose not to. Right? These things are fundamental and obvious, but we don't like to admit them because we want to believe the narrative that we teach ourselves that we are in control of our outcomes. Well, guess what? You're not. You're only in control of how you respond to the realities of your environment. You may be in control of how much risk you give yourself to add to the griefs of your life. Certainly that's true, but by no means can you undo the things that have been done. You know, you might enhance the healing, you might improve the outcome by exerting your will, but you won't take away the fact that an injury has taken place. You are constrained in biology. You're also constrained in your comprehension. Like, you can't possibly choose to do something that you didn't think was possible, didn't even conceive was a possibility, rather, as opposed to something that you have rejected as being possible. It didn't even occur to you that it was a possibility. You can't choose that. Like, you might actually do it anyway. That's not an exertion of your will. That's circumstantial. That's we might call it divine, right? And by accident, many great inventions have taken place as men have perceived the reality of the world more fully because of something they accidentally discovered. You can exert your will to try and get into the realm of theoretical ideas and exploring by experiment so that you might then perceive the thing that you couldn't have imagined could have been possible in the first place. That's in the realm of the will. But you can't choose to believe in something or understand something that you didn't even know was possible to understand, right? That's not a function of the will. Like, you need to understand that opportunity is not subject to your will. I'll talk a little bit more about that, because opportunity is something which I have observed oftentimes to be unfair in the reality of people's experience of the world. I had a pretty epic military career for 20 years. I did some pretty awesome stuff, and I got most everything I ever desired to do happened to work out for me. Not because I'm amazing. I'm sure my peers and colleagues would agree with that. But largely because of what you would call luck, what I would call God's mercy and grace. Right time, right place. Like, I was in the right place to take a platoon on a stability operation in Haiti and be a platoon commander overseas, and to demonstrate that I had some potential to people who happened to be there, who were open-minded enough to believe that I had potential and to see that. Which by no means was certain, if I were to tell you the whole story of my entrance into regimental life. And I had the opportunity then to be taken overseas in spite of, maybe burning a few bridges behind me early in my career as a LAV captain in Afghanistan. And I get combat experience as a frontline officer. And that wasn't by my choice. I agreed with conforming my will to the opportunity as it was presented. But I know a lot of senior officers, even in the combat arms in Canada, who because of circumstance were never in the right time or place to have even a single tour as an operational commander or officer. They, at best had an opportunity to be a desk officer or a staff officer, which just doesn't confer the same experience and possibilities. Not because they didn't do something right, but because the opportunity simply wasn't there. Your will to exert, your will to create opportunities can impact that, but it isn't sovereign over it. Like, you can't possibly simply choose to have opportunities that aren't granted by circumstance or by the environment that you're in, by others who choose to give them to you. Like, it's very easy to say anyone can be rich, anyone can be Bill Gates, happened to him. Yeah, but that's not true. Like, it's true that it did happen to Bill Gates, showing that it is a possibility for such a thing to happen. But the vast majority of people simply don't ever get the opportunities, whether or not they had the willpower and the wherewithal and the skill sets to have accomplished the same thing. If you grow up as a slum kid in the Philippines or Haiti, or you grow up as a tribesman in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, you're not going to be Bill Gates. And if you do end up somehow becoming a person who is able to have those opportunities, it's not because you chose it, it's because other wills acted and other circumstances prevailed to make those opportunities available to you, right? So see that your will is constrained. See that it is constrained by circumstance. It is constrained in time. It is constrained in biology. It is constrained in comprehension, in what you know. It is constrained by the world. And finally, and probably most importantly, what I want to talk about in some depth here is the idea that it is constrained by the collective will of other people. Collective will is so important. We don't talk about it nearly enough to understand what it is to be those who operate in a sphere of collective will. You are not sovereign over your story because there are many other people, like nearly 8 billion or so now, that are also trying to live out their own stories. And those are generally butting into yours. So we have this idea of collective will. If you don't have it, get it. It is that which is the collective efforts of all men, right? And they're not all working in one direction. They're generally pointing all over the place in various directions. We need collective will to be effective. Your will in isolation is not effective. It's not effective to impact the world in any significant or meaningful way. There is a show that I've watched a bit of with my kids called Dr. Stone. It's an anime. And the premise of this anime is that you have this guy, and he is essentially the smartest human being to have ever lived. And there is of course, basically magical nanovirus thing that encases everyone in stone or turns them into stone. And like 3,000 years pass, and he wakes up and he's the first human being, at least in the world that he is around, to have waken from this disease. And to have woken from this disease. And then he finds himself in a pristine nature where pretty much everything is crumbled away, and he has to live. But what they've done very intelligently in that show is that they have explored the problem of you trying to exert your will in isolation of other wills. Because although the main character in that story has inherited all of the wisdom of mankind and has somehow transcribed it into his photographic memory, he still isn't able, in his reality without any tools, without any technology, to do anything more than basically subsist and survive. And that is a sketchy process at best. And ultimately, he manages, in his great exertion of will and application of wisdom that was received by others, from others, by their efforts, he manages to concoct nitric acid and yada yada. He frees someone else, and that someone else then can help him by allowing him to specialize by doing the labor. And then as they free more and more people, they're able to progress collectively because they're able to specialize their wills into the spheres of greatest capability, right? Specialization, like basic fundamental economic theory of specialization. We work better when we each are able, by pooling our efforts, to work within our best capability. And then collectively we all benefit, which is great until, of course, he wakes up the one guy who works against him and basically wants to destroy everything from the old world and destroy technology, and now you have competing wills. But the point here that needs to be kind of understood is that we don't exert our will in isolation. Like, exerting your will in isolation, you're nearly powerless. Imagine yourself, like, if you were born into the world without someone to care for you and guide you, you would just simply die, because you're a human, and human babies on their own, don't actually get to thrive. Even Tarzan had to be raised by an ape in the story, right? And the fact is that even had you been raised, then you would be receiving the blessing of somebody else's will to raise you and to equip you with knowledge to work in your environment. If you then were placed into this environment without the received collective will, the products of everyone's collective will, technologically and intellectually, into this wild wilderness, like they sometimes do this on the Discovery shows, and they put people up with next to nothing, or a naked survivor gets dropped in the jungle and tries to survive. Well, they basically exist, and it's a test to see how long they can continue to not thrive, but exist in that world. We don't have the ability to exert our wills to accomplish like anything in domination of the world around us until we pool our efforts together. Like, your idea of free will is nonsense if you perceive yourself to be unconstrained in your will. So you need, for a functional worldview that actually equips you to deal with the reality of the world and yourself, to have a right humbling of the self and to see how deeply constrained you are as a person in the exertion of your will. Now, this is not determinism. It's not determinism that says there is no purpose in trying. Like, Calvinism in a Christian context is often accused of having this pre-selection of all mankind for salvation, which leads people to not have any reason to try. And that's possible. It's possible if you wrongly apply these lessons that I'm telling you right now, that you could grow apathetic and say, my will is so constrained that it doesn't matter what I do. The world's going to go on without me. I can barely impact the world. Yeah, that's not what I'm saying. I am trying to teach you how you can focus all of your energy into the one place that you can actually have a real effect on the world by having a right view of yourself and not having fantasy stories that teach you that you are some kind of hero, which we all have, by the way, in our heads. We all imagine ourselves the hero. Like, you're not the great hero. And if you ever become a great hero, it will only because you rightly understood this principle of where you can properly influence the world with real effect and stop putting all of your energy into places that are pointless because you don't have an unconstrained will to have impact. So here it is. Braveheart, Mel Gibson. Many of you, I hope, have watched that movie. Probably a lot of you haven't, because it's quite a bit older than maybe some of the crowd listening. But you're probably familiar with at least some of the themes from it. You can take our lives, but you can never take our freedom. Okay, so the real William Wallace seemingly was a real person. At least he's enshrined in saga. The scene at the start of that movie, basically, where William Wallace's wife, who he secretly married, gets killed because he kills a guy for trying to sleep with her, etc., etc. Anyway, it's a long story. And then he goes in and basically single-handedly kills everyone in this little fortification, Bailey. These English soldiers, some 20 or so guys that are supposed to be securing the area. Well, that is the thing that supposedly really happened, according to the testimony of the era, that William Wallace went in and basically single-handedly, he was a brute, killed 20 English soldiers or something in a Motte and Bailey, and that led to an uprising. You can do that. Like, the whole wife thing is probably totally Mel Gibson's way of justifying it, but you can destroy. That's the one thing you can exert your influence on the world to do, the free exercise of your will. You can go and destroy other people's will, at least until they destroy yours in retaliation. You do have the authority to do that. But understand that if what William Wallace wanted to accomplish was to free his people from oppression, the destruction of that 20 men wasn't it. That was only an incident leading to greater oppression and the riling up of the English to go and fight back and put down and, to destroy. The only thing that actually led to independence for the Scottish was when the collective will of the people was rallied, and arguably William Wallace did have an influence in that by inspiring them to unite their wills against the English domination of their country at that time. I guess still not 100% on how all that works in Great Britain politics, but they have their own parliament, so whatever. The point is that it was the uniting of the collective will that made a difference. And it wasn't the destruction of that 20-man defense outpost. That did nothing. Unless it was directed towards changing people's hearts towards a unification of effort. And frankly, whether or not William Wallace had anything to do with that is highly debatable historically. But in the movie, so we'll just follow the narrative of the movie, it was his challenging people to step outside themselves and risk dying today for the sake of actually doing something worthwhile for their children and their grandchildren, that there might be freedom, as though freedom was the thing that would make life perfect and great for Scotland. And in trying to unite people's wills, he was successful, but his real influence was not his killing individually, it was his unification of people to a common purpose. That's exertion of the will in the now that has power over people. And I had said earlier that your will is constrained by your lack of comprehension. So there is this passage in Romans, Paul speaks about this, and he says, "How will they call on him when they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching?" Something you can actually do in your now, where you have real influence, not in the future, but in the now, is you can teach people concepts that will change their perspective and unite them in a common purpose that is productive for people collectively. That's what Christianity did, right? That's what Jesus did when he submitted his will to the Father, according to the testimony given to us in the Gospels, that he didn't do his own will, but he submitted his will to the Father's will, and he taught people by his example to conform themselves to self-sacrificial living, preferring one another above oneself, and seeking to do all according to the principles of God. And what happens when people actually do that, and you convince them to do that by preaching and teaching the productive unification of the will to common good, is that it does get better in this life. That's a real powerful expression of the will. It's something you can do to actually unite wills with yours. It's like the only interface you have that fully can profit that pushing forward of humanity. Now, of course, there's other things that people can be united to, other wills and other ideas. They don't have the evidence of having been especially good, most of them. But that's a different conversation. We'll talk about that in trying to understand who God is, and that'll be another video. I want to talk about that fully separately. The point is that your will functions in the now, and the way in which you can influence other people's will is either by destroying them, which definitely tends to turn others into decisive enemies. Not to say there isn't a place for it, because I fundamentally believe that there is, in a unification of effort under a governmental effort. But that's a whole different discussion as well. Or you can, in your smallness, choose to impact the life of the person next to you by teaching them, by exemplifying what you think is good, and by demonstrating selflessness. And when we all demonstrate selflessness, everybody prospers. That's the beauty of Christianity, is that it actually functionally works in this life, even though, as a principle, it's not about this life. It's about submitting yourself to that which matters because it matters, and obeying God because he's worth it, etc., etc. All right. Here is the biggest problem that we need to attack in this whole dialogue about our will, is that we all think we're Braveheart. We think we're Mel Gibson. Our narrative, our personal narrative, is always about us being Dr. Stone, being Neo, or being Braveheart, right? And we must be the one. Like, why do we watch zombie movies as a society? It's not because we think how great it would be to be the zombies. It's because we always imagine we're the protagonist who's going to survive. In our heads, you know, we prepare for the zombie apocalypse because we're going to be the guy that defeats the zombies and then prospers when everyone else has moved out of our way and all these competing wills aren't a problem for us. And they neglect the fact that in the zombie apocalypse, the only way you survive is by the inheritance you've gotten from the collective will that made that firearm, that made the industry that made the firearm, that made the industry that made the canned goods you're eating, etc., and eventually, like, your will to power in that catastrophic outcome, even should you be the hero, can only possibly be good when you unify other wills to recreate those things. But the reality is, a friend of mine often says, we all like to think that we're Braveheart, but we're probably just the guy with the arrow in the butt who didn't turn his shield up in time. Braveheart was only powerful because all of the warriors bound themselves to his purpose and fought with him, and most of them were nameless. But it's good to be one of the nameless ones fighting for that purpose. And if you do that faithfully, the opportunity may present itself that you could be the one in charge. That's terrible. Being in charge is a terrible burden if you actually want to do good and you aren't in it for yourself. It's terrible, but it's worthy. So take it. If it should present itself, take the opportunity. But just strive to be on the right side, fighting for the right cause. Subvert your will. Don't express it wildly in all kinds of directions that can't possibly have effect. Know what you are. If you want to start having true integrity, have a right view of yourself. Recognize that you are extremely limited, and then pour yourself into the area that you have actual power to influence, which is right now, and it is in your actions and in your words, what you choose to do with those things. And it is in the actions of choosing to remove ignorance from yourself and understand things that you may not have previously understood, so that you might perceive things that might be opportunities for future actions that would be better than what you have done. This is where your strength is. And if you don't want to conform yourself to Christianity, maybe you should try and understand what it is and see if maybe it's the answer. Now, you might say the same thing to me about Islam or Buddhism or, paganism, Wodenism, Gnosticism, etc., etc. I do actually try to understand those things. Like, I've basically devoted my life to trying to understand all these things. And, yeah, do that fine. Seek the truth. But if you seek it honestly, I do believe you'll find it in Christ. I do believe that you will find it in the Son of God, not as a figure or a symbol, but in the real person of the Son of God who will change you. But I ask you to look. Don't just listen to a video that says, hey, guess what? You're limited in your will, and then throw a hissy fit, unsubscribe, and wander on with your life. Challenge yourself to grow and to have a real impact in a way that can change the world positively. Be one of the many, many millions of people who were faceless and nameless, and yet contributed in their collective unification of will to the historical effort that is the Judeo-Christian world that we in the West have inherited, and which we're casting aside by neglecting it with our collective will. Moreover, conform your will to that which has eternal value, which is not just in this physical realm where you're going to die one way or the other, in fact, but that can possibly give you hope for eternity, that I have and many others have, that can change you fundamentally so that you can have peace and joy even when you suffer, even when your life sucks and is constant pain, right? Can teach you how to actually apply your will profitably to overcome those things and to be strong in this world and in the lives of other people. Do you want this? Recognize something. The red pill. Neo, in the story, was nobody. He was nobody, and he didn't contribute anything to his own salvation. Neo in the story was given by someone's preaching the opportunity to come to a right and real view of the world because somebody else had worked it out and was freely offering that to him. His choice was to take the pill. And then when he had taken the pill and was awakened to the real world, it was hard. And not everybody was on his side. And he still had to deal with people trapped in the other worlds in their minds, unwilling to acknowledge the reality of their circumstance. And he only became a hero because of the collective efforts of many, many other people in that narrative who, like him, had taken the same pill and conformed themselves to suffering for something that would heal humanity for anyone who would take it. It's a good story. Take Christ, be Christ-pilled, wake up, and see that there is so much more here that you can do if you conform your will to that has real power, like Jesus did, and conform your will to the will of the Father. Hooah. There's my challenge for today, and perhaps we'll be back to hit on the integrity aspect of knowing who God is and what God is in our next video. Peace out. Throw your comments down below if you have them. Invite a conversation. If you have serious questions, I might throw a video answer together as I have in the past. And I pray Godspeed to you. Cheers.